The people of California will never forget that day. Emma Thompson, a 4-year-old girl, was brutally murdered. However, what caused this confrontation? As we continue to investigate this startling situation, stay tuned to our narrative. Willow Creek was a place where time seemed to stand still. Tucked away among the rolling hills of California, it was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The streets were lined with modest homes, their white picket fences, and neatly trimmed lawns, evoking an image of simplicity and tranquility. It was the kind of town where the mailman was a familiar face, where neighbors shared more than just the morning coffee, and where the sound of children playing was a comforting constant. Yet, despite its outward appearance of serenity, Willow Creek harbored secrets buried so deeply that only the most perceptive could even begin to notice them. Among these secrets was the story of Emma Thompson, a young girl whose life would tragically end far too soon, at the tender age of 4. Emma's mother, Diana, was a woman marked by both beauty and sadness. She had moved to Willow Creek years earlier with her then-husband, a man who, like many others in her life, had eventually disappeared from the picture. Emma's father was a truck driver, often away for long stretches of time, and Diana had become accustomed to being a single mother. Though she tried to fill the void with work and occasional friendships, her life was largely a solitary one. Emma, however, was the bright spot in her world. Her daughter's laughter was the music that kept Diana going, the small face of innocence that reminded her there was still beauty in the world. But the reality of single motherhood began to weigh on Diana as the years went by. Raising Emma alone was exhausting, and with each passing day, Diana found herself more and more drained, physically, emotionally, and mentally. It was during one of these difficult times that Diana met Mark. He was new to town, a quiet man with a rough edge, and his presence seemed to fill a void in Diana's life that she had long since stopped admitting existed. He had recently been released from prison, and although the details of his past were vague, Diana was willing to overlook the question marks that hovered around him. He seemed, at first, like a man who had learned from his mistakes, someone who simply needed a second chance. He quickly charmed Diana with his seemingly gentle nature, the soft way he looked at her, and the way he listened when she spoke. It didn't take long before Mark moved in with Diana and Emma. But behind the facade of normalcy, cracks began to appear. At first, they were subtle, barely noticeable. Mark would become withdrawn at times, lost in thought, or pacing around the house like a caged animal. His anger, when it surfaced, was quick and sharp, like a sudden storm that tore through the calm without warning. Diana tried to make excuses for him, telling herself that his temper was a product of his past, of the things he had endured before coming to Willow Creek. She convinced herself that with time, things would get better, that he would find peace and the demons of his past would no longer haunt him. She overlooked the way his gaze would sometimes linger too long on Emma, or how his voice would carry an edge when he addressed the little girl. Emma, once so full of life and curiosity, began to change as well. The spark that had always been in her eyes seemed to dim, and she became quieter, more withdrawn. She no longer ran to greet Diana with open arms when she returned from work, nor did she chatter excitedly about the day's adventures. Instead, she would sit by the window, her small fingers tracing patterns on the glass, her thoughts a mystery even to her own mother. Diana didn't want to believe that Mark could be the cause of this shift in her daughter's behavior, but deep down, she began to sense that something was wrong. Still, she told herself that Emma was just adjusting to the changes in their lives, that every child goes through phases. After all, Mark had never done anything outright alarming. He was a good man, wasn't he? But as the weeks wore on, the signs became harder to ignore. Emma's bruises, first chalked up to the clumsiness of childhood, became more frequent, more pronounced. Diana noticed them more and more, but she couldn't bring herself to confront Mark. She told herself that it was nothing, that children get hurt sometimes, that accidents happen. The odd thing was, Emma never seemed to complain. When Diana would ask her what happened, Emma would shake her head, her eyes avoiding her mother's gaze. It was as if Emma had learned to accept the pain, to swallow the truth for fear of something worse. There were whispers among the neighbors. They had seen Mark and Diana arguing more often, heard the muffled sounds of conflict coming from inside the house. Some of the older women in the neighborhood offered Diana advice, urging her to be careful with Mark, to trust her instincts. But Diana, despite her growing unease, was unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. She had already sacrificed so much for Emma, and the thought of losing what little stability she had left was too terrifying to bear. So she ignored the warning signs, rationalizing them away as the natural friction that arises in any relationship. After all, things couldn't be that bad, could they? As the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, the walls around Diana's perception of her life began to close in. The man she had allowed into her home, into her heart, had begun to show his true colors, and the cost of that naivety would be far higher than she ever imagined. But by the time Diana realized just how deeply the darkness had sunk into her life, it was already too late. In the weeks leading up to Emma's disappearance, the town of Willow Creek felt a subtle shift, an undercurrent of unease that only those who were paying attention could feel. It wasn't immediately obvious to everyone, but the small changes began to accumulate, like tiny cracks in the foundation of a once sturdy house. Diana, who had always been an optimistic woman despite her difficult circumstances, began to retreat into herself. Her once eager smile, the one that had brightened every room she entered, started to fade, replaced by a look of exhaustion that even her closest friends couldn't ignore. It wasn't the exhaustion of someone who simply needed rest. It was the weary resignation of a woman who had already fought too many battles, one that made her seem both older and more vulnerable than her years. She seemed more withdrawn, more distant, as though she had become a spectator in her own life. Mark, too, began to change. In the beginning, his rough edges were masked by his charm, by his quiet yet intense way of speaking. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a darker side to him began to emerge. He stopped making small talk with the neighbors, stopped offering a warm wave when he passed by on his late-night walks. Instead, he became a figure shrouded in mystery, often disappearing for hours, his whereabouts unknown. No one could put their finger on it, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved through the world now, as if he were carrying some invisible weight that made him both volatile and unreachable. It was during this time that Emma's behavior began to shift as well. The change in her was gradual, so subtle that at first it was easy to dismiss. She had always been a lively child, quick to smile, and eager to share her little world with anyone who would listen. But soon, Emma began to retreat into herself. She became more withdrawn, her once bouncy energy replaced with an eerie stillness. At first, Diana chalked it up to the changes in their home Mark's presence, the new routines, but there was an unsettling quality to Emma's silence that felt unnatural. She no longer ran to her mother when she came home from work, no longer greeted her with the same enthusiasm. Instead, Emma would sit quietly in corners, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant, as though she were lost in a world of her own. Diana noticed the bruises on Emma more frequently, though she continued to convince herself that they were just the result of a child's natural clumsiness. Emma was, after all, a little girl, and children got hurt. It was part of growing up. Still, the marks seemed to appear with a regularity that made Diana's stomach churn. They were small at first, a bruise on her knee or a scrape on her elbow. But as time passed, the bruises began to take on a darker hue, some spreading across her arms and legs in patterns that made Diana feel a gnawing sense of unease. When Diana asked Emma what had happened, the little girl would simply look away, her eyes avoiding her mother's gaze, and mutter that she had fallen. But something in her expression, a mixture of fear and resignation, made Diana question the truth of Emma's words. There were moments, too, when Diana would hear strange sounds coming from the house, muffled thumps, or the sound of things being knocked over. These sounds were often followed by silence, deep and oppressive. Diana would pause, standing in the doorway, her heart racing as she wondered if her ears were playing tricks on her. But when she ventured inside, Mark would be sitting calmly on the couch, his expression unreadable, and Emma would be nowhere in sight, retreating to her room or playing in the backyard. Diana would shake off the uneasy feeling, blaming it on the stress of daily life. but the strange occurrences lingered in the back of her mind, like shadows that refused to disappear. The neighbors began to notice the change in the household as well. Mark, who had once been a polite, if somewhat distant presence, began to withdraw from the community. He no longer greeted people on the street or engaged in the casual exchanges that had once been so common. He was always in a hurry now, walking briskly, his head down, as if he were trying to avoid being noticed. Diana, too, began to seem more distant, less connected to the people around her. She no longer joined the other mothers for coffee at the park, nor did she chat with the neighbors over the fence as she once had. Instead, she spent most of her time inside, her presence in the house almost ghostly, as if she had become part of the wallpaper. The once vibrant home on Maple Street now seemed cold and empty, as though the life that had once filled its rooms had been drained away. The laughter of children playing in the yard was replaced by silence, and the cheerful music that had often played in the background was now absent, leaving only the heavy silence of a house in turmoil. Emma's absence from the front porch was especially noticeable. The other children would pass by and peer through the fence, looking for her, but she was always inside, always silent, her small figure barely visible through the window. Diana would sometimes notice the curious glances from the other mothers, the quiet murmurs, but she would look away, unable to face the questions she knew they were asking behind her back. It was during this time, when the tension in the house reached a breaking point, that the first signs of true danger began to show themselves. Mark's temper, once controlled and hidden beneath layers of charm, started to unravel. Diana would catch him muttering to himself at night, his fists clenched at his sides, his body rigid with barely contained rage. The arguments between him and Diana grew more frequent, though they were always whispered behind closed doors. Emma, who had once been a curious observer of the world around her, now seemed to be constantly on edge. Diana would catch her standing in the doorway, her small hands clutching the frame as if she were trying to hold herself together in the face of something far bigger than she could understand. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm waiting to break, and yet Diana refused to acknowledge the danger that was so clearly creeping into her home. She couldn't, or perhaps didn't want to. To confront the truth would mean acknowledging that the man she had allowed into their lives, into Emma's life, was not the man he appeared to be. It would mean acknowledging that the damage had already been done, that Emma was no longer safe in her own home. But Diana didn't see it, not yet. She was still too wrapped up in her need to believe that things would get better, that Mark would change, that Emma would return to her old self. The signs were there, small, almost imperceptible, and yet Diana refused to see them for what they truly were. By the time she realized the true extent of the danger they were in, it was already too late. The quiet terror that had taken root in her home had already begun to grow, and soon it would be too powerful to stop. The morning of Emma's disappearance began like any other in Willow Creek, with the sun rising over the horizon, casting long shadows across the sleepy streets of the town. It was a quiet, crisp day of those early autumn mornings, when the air was cool, but the warmth of the sun still made the world feel soft. The routine of the household had become predictable. Diana woke early, prepared breakfast for herself and Emma, and Mark, as always, disappeared before the day truly began. His absences were frequent and never questioned by the few who still spoke to him, though the estrangement from the community had grown over the past months. He seemed content to leave the house before anyone noticed his absence, as if it were part of the strange rhythm that had become their lives. Emma, as usual, had been the first one up, her small feet padding across the hardwood floor as she wandered around the house in a daze, her wide eyes betraying an unease that Diana had come to dismiss as part of growing up. The little girl, with her innocent face and her soft voice, had always been an early riser, and Diana had grown used to seeing her first thing in the morning. It was their time together, those brief moments before the demands of the day took over. Diana had always thought of these quiet mornings as weary, but on that particular morning, something was off. Diana couldn't quite place it, but there was a subtle sense of wrongness that clung to the air, like a tension that had yet to break. Emma's silence felt more profound than usual, and Diana, who had grown accustomed to the quiet withdrawal of her daughter in recent weeks, felt a small chill crawl up her spine. She found Emma standing by the window, staring out into the backyard, her little face pressed against the glass. Diana called out to her, but Emma didn't respond. It was as though she hadn't heard her at all, her gaze fixed on something distant, something unseen. Diana brushed off the unease that gnawed at her. It was, after all, just another morning, and Emma would be Emma. With a soft sigh, Diana went about the usual routine. She prepared a simple breakfast for the two of them, and as the minutes passed, Emma finally turned away from the window and shuffled to the table. Her small hands, pale and delicate, picked at the food in front of her, but she ate without her usual enthusiasm. It was strange, but Diana didn't say anything. She didn't want to disturb the fragile peace they had managed to establish in their home. It wasn't until later that morning, when Diana had stepped out for a brief errand, that things took a turn for the worse. When she returned, the house was eerily quiet. Mark wasn't home, which, though typical, still felt unnerving given his recent absences. Diana called out for Emma, expecting to hear her daughter's voice, but there was nothing. The house seemed hollow, devoid of life. It wasn't until she checked the backyard, the place Emma had spent so much of her time, that Diana's heart began to race. There was no sign of the little girl, no traces of her usual wanderings, no toys scattered across the grass, no markers of the small world Emma had created in the yard. Panic began to creep into Diana's chest as she searched the house. Emma's room was empty, her bed untouched, and the soft pink blankets she had so carefully arranged the night before were now a pile of crumpled fabric on the floor. Diana's mind raced as she ran through the possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She checked the bathroom, the closets, even under the bed, but there was no sign of Emma. It was as if the child had simply vanished into thin air. The first thought that crossed Diana's mind, irrational as it was that Emma had wandered off, maybe to the park or to one of the nearby streets. But the streets were empty. The neighborhood, which had once been full of children's laughter and the sound of voices, was quiet. Diana's frantic search grew more desperate. She ran down the block, knocking on doors, asking anyone if they had seen her daughter. But no one had. No one had seen Emma leave the house, and no one had heard anything unusual. The absence of answers made the fear in Diana's chest grow louder, more insistent. By the time the police were called, the town's sense of calm had already been shattered. Officers arrived quickly, their faces serious as they began combing through the area, searching for any trace of the missing child. The investigation, however, was initially hampered by the lack of evidence. There were no signs of a struggle in the house or outside. The yard was undisturbed, the door to the house locked, and the windows intact. It was as if Emma had simply disappeared into thin air, her presence erased without a trace. The detectives were thorough in their questioning, speaking with neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have seen something unusual. Diana, in a daze of panic and disbelief, could barely form coherent sentences as she tried to recall every detail of the morning. She mentioned the small bruises she had noticed on Emma in recent weeks, but she didn't say anything about her growing suspicions about Mark. She didn't want to believe that he could be involved in Emma's disappearance, despite the sense of unease that had been building in her heart for months. She couldn't bring herself to entertain the thought that the man she had invited into her life, into Emma's life, could be capable of harming her daughter. The police began their investigation by interviewing Mark, though his whereabouts during the time of Emma's disappearance were unclear. He had been seen leaving the house earlier that morning, as he often did, but no one could say where he had gone. His alibi was vague, and his answers to questions seemed increasingly evasive. He claimed to have been at a friend's house, though no one could confirm his whereabouts during the critical window of time when Emma had vanished. The investigators noted his behavior, how his eyes would shift when the subject of Emma came up, how his voice would falter when asked about his relationship with the child. There was something in his demeanor that made the detectives uneasy, but they had no concrete evidence to suggest his involvement. Diana, meanwhile, struggled to hold herself together. The reality of what had happened, of her daughter being gone, of the silence that had descended upon their home, was unbearable. She couldn't stop pacing the house, couldn't stop running over the events in her mind, trying to find any small detail that might explain where Emma had gone or who might have taken her. But there were no answers, only the hollow, oppressive silence that seemed to press in on all sides. As the days passed, the investigation grew more intense. Search teams combed the surrounding areas, and volunteers joined the effort, spreading out into the woods and along the nearby rivers. The community, once so peaceful and sheltered, was now consumed by the search for Emma, their faces drawn with the same anxiety and fear that had begun to consume Diana. It was clear that something was terribly wrong, but no one knew what. No one knew who was responsible for Emma's disappearance. And as the days turned into weeks, the hope of finding her alive began to fade. The investigation became a delicate dance of suspicion and uncertainty. Each new lead brought more questions than answers. The police had no choice but to dig deeper into Mark's past, uncovering fragments of his criminal history details that Diana had either overlooked or simply chosen to ignore. The truth, however, remained elusive. The town of Willow Creek had been changed forever, its innocence shattered by the quiet horror that had unfolded in one of its own homes. The investigation into Emma's disappearance, which initially seemed like a random case of a missing child, slowly began to take on a darker, more sinister tone as the weeks passed. What had initially been assumed to be a possible abduction, or perhaps a child wandering off, gradually gave way to a more chilling narrative. Emma's disappearance, the more the detectives dug into the details, seemed less like an accident and more like the tragic culmination of years of hidden suffering. It began with the interviews. As the detectives went deeper into the lives of the family, they started to uncover disturbing fragments. Neighbors had been hesitant to speak up, but once the investigation began in earnest, they were more willing to share their observations. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Holloway, had noticed that Emma rarely played with other children, despite being at an age where socializing was normal. She recalled how the little girl often seemed withdrawn, preferring to stay inside the house, looking out the windows or playing quietly in the corner of the yard. At first, Mrs. Holloway thought it was just the girl's nature. But as time passed, she began to suspect something more. Mrs. Holloway also recalled hearing raised voices from the house at odd hours of the night. While she couldn't make out the exact words, there was an unmistakable tension that hung in the air when Mark was around. She'd seen him before, always looking disheveled, his eyes sharp with a strange intensity. His temper, she'd noted, seemed to be unpredictable. At one point, she had even witnessed him snapping at Emma when she had accidentally spilled a glass of juice, though the incident seemed too brief for anyone to have realized the extent of the tension in the household. Yet, Mrs. Holloway, like many others in the neighborhood, had chalked it up to the stress of everyday life. They never truly suspected that there was more to it. The detectives, however, were beginning to see the pattern. Emma's behavior, the withdrawal, the silence, it wasn't just the behavior of a shy child. It was the behavior of a child who had suffered, a child who had been conditioned to be quiet, to avoid drawing attention to herself. As the investigation continued, more disturbing revelations came to light. Teachers, who had initially spoken of Emma as a sweet but quiet child, began to speak up about her interactions at school. One teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, recalled an incident during class where Emma had flinched when another child had accidentally brushed against her arm. Emma, Mrs. Reynolds said, had looked panicked, almost like she was bracing for something. The teacher had dismissed it as a nervous reaction, but now, in hindsight, the signs were all too clear. Emma had been scared of touch, scared of people getting too close. The more they dug, the clearer it became that Emma's life had been filled with quiet suffering. Her mother, Diana, had been too consumed by the toxic relationship with Mark to see the warning signs. She had been blind to the growing tension, to the subtle ways in which Emma had begun to withdraw. There were moments, small, quiet moments, where Diana had felt something was wrong. But she had pushed those feelings aside, convincing herself that Emma was just going through a phase. After all, Mark had always been charming, even affectionate when the mood suited him. Diana had ignored the occasional harsh words, the coldness that Mark would sometimes direct toward Emma, convincing herself that it was just a product of the stress they were under. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that Mark's affection was never genuine. He had manipulated Diana, controlling her emotions and isolating her from the truth. Emma's suffering had been hidden in plain sight, masked by the appearance of a normal family. The abuse had started slowly, little things that Diana had brushed off. The bruises on Emma's arms, the occasional mark on her face, had been dismissed as accidents. Mark had always been quick to offer an explanation, telling Diana that the bruises were from play, that Emma was clumsy. But as the years passed, the explanations grew thinner. The bruises grew darker, more frequent, and Emma's withdrawn behavior intensified. It wasn't until after Emma's disappearance that Diana began to connect the dots. She started to remember the small moments, the ones she had rationalized or ignored, the way Emma had flinched when Mark had touched her, the way she had avoided eye contact when Diana had asked about the marks on her skin. Diana began to realize that the subtle clues she had once dismissed were all pointing to something horrifying. Emma had been suffering at the hands of Mark for years, and Diana had been too lost in her own pain to see it. The truth slowly started to come to light as the detectives turned their attention to Mark's past. They discovered a pattern of behavior and unsettling history that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of charm and deceit. Mark had been arrested once, years before, for a violent altercation in a neighboring town. The incident had been brushed under the rug, the charges dropped after a settlement had been reached. His violent tendencies, it seemed, had never truly gone away. In fact, they had only worsened over the years. Neighbors had reported seeing him hit Emma on several occasions, but none of them had done anything about it, either too afraid or too hesitant to intervene. With this new information, the detectives began to look closer at the night before Emma's disappearance. It was clear now that the night had been the culmination of months, perhaps years, of escalating violence. Mark, it seemed, had finally lost control. The signs of the abuse were no longer subtle. They were undeniable. Emma's bruises, her fear, the way she had seemed to shrink in on herself, these were the physical and emotional marks of years of torment. Mark, it appeared, had finally snapped. The final moments before Emma's disappearance were the most harrowing. According to the evidence, Emma had tried to escape, to flee the household, but her small body had been no match for Mark's rage. In the quiet of the night, she had made a run for the door, but Mark had caught up to her, dragging her back into the house, where the worst of the violence took place. He had beaten her, leaving her bruised and battered, her small body broken. It was a crime of razzia, final act of control. Mark had crossed a line, one he could never uncross. In the aftermath, it was revealed that Emma's death had been the result of a violent altercation that had escalated beyond anyone's control. The physical evidence found at the scene, combined with the testimonies from neighbors and the forensic investigation, painted a grim picture of what had occurred. Emma had been murdered in cold blood, her life extinguished by the hands of the person who was supposed to protect her. The truth of Emma's abuse and murder shattered the community. The shockwaves of the revelation reverberated through Willow Creek, leaving its residents in disbelief. The man they had all known, Mark, the seemingly charming, seemingly normal man, was revealed to be nothing more than a monster, a man capable of horrific violence. Diana, too, was left reeling. She had been blind to the signs, consumed by her own pain and manipulation. She could no longer deny the truth. Emma's suffering had been right in front of her, and she had failed to see it. The case of Emma's death became a grim reminder of the dangers of ignoring the signs of abuse, of failing to see the truth even when it was staring you in the face. It was a tragic tale of manipulation, control, and the ultimate cost of silence. Emma had been a victim, not only of her abuser, but also of the system that had failed to protect her, of a mother who had been too consumed by her own darkness to save her child. And now, with the truth out in the open, there was no turning back. The discovery of Emma's lifeless body was a turning point in the investigation. It came after weeks of searching the surrounding woods, combing through abandoned properties, and following false leads that seemed to go nowhere. The breakthrough came when a hiker, who had been walking through the forest trails just outside Willow Creek, stumbled upon something that didn't quite belong in the serene landscape. Hidden beneath a thick pile of fallen leaves, Emma's small body was found, discarded like an afterthought, abandoned in the same way her life had been treated. It was clear from the position of her body and the surrounding evidence that the location was not chosen at random. It had been a place Mark knew well, a secluded spot, far from the prying eyes of the town. The discovery of Emma's body sparked a renewed sense of urgency among the authorities. They quickly secured the scene, marking it off as a crime scene. Forensic teams arrived within hours, working quickly to gather any evidence that might help piece together what had happened. The condition of the body confirmed the worst. Emma had been beaten, and her injuries were consistent with the abuse that had been reported by the neighbors. The severity of her injuries left no doubt that her death had not been an accident. This was murder. As the investigation progressed, the detective's attention turned to Mark, whose behavior had begun to seem increasingly erratic. His previous denials now appeared hollow in light of the evidence. He had repeatedly claimed that he had no idea where Emma had gone, that he had last seen her playing outside. But as the forensic evidence and witness statements began to line up, it became clear that his version of events didn't hold up. The arrest came swiftly. Mark, who had been a fixture in the community, was taken into custody early one morning, his cold demeanor doing little to mask the overwhelming evidence against him. The arrest shocked the town to its core. Mark, the seemingly perfect husband and father, the man who had been the face of normalcy, was now the prime suspect in the brutal murder of his young daughter. As the handcuffs were placed on him, there was no hint of remorse in his eyes, no sign of the man who had once been a caring father. It was as though the monster within him had been fully revealed, and in that moment, the truth that had been concealed for so long could no longer be ignored. The arrest was a pivotal moment, but it was also a painful one. The residents of Willow Creek had been forced to confront the reality of the darkness that had existed right under their noses. Emma's death, once a mystery, was now a stark, brutal reality. And as Mark was led away in handcuffs, the full scope of the tragedy was laid bare for all to see. The aftermath of Emma's death reverberated throughout Willow Creek, a small town that had once prided itself on its tight-knit, peaceful community. The arrest of Mark had shaken everyone to their core. The truth, once buried beneath layers of charm and deceit, was now exposed in all its horror. For the residents, the revelation that someone they had known, someone who had blended seamlessly into their everyday lives, could commit such a monstrous act was a jarring blow. They were left to grapple with the loss, not only of a child who had been cruelly taken from the world, but of their own sense of safety and normalcy. The investigation did not end with Mark's arrest. The long road to justice was paved with a series of difficult and often painful legal proceedings. The community, already grieving the loss of Emma, now had to watch as the legal system unfolded, piece by piece, revealing more about the violence that had been lurking in the shadows of their town. Mark's trial was set to begin months later, and as the date approached, it became clear that this would be a deeply emotional and drawn-out process. Diana, Emma's mother, found herself caught in the middle. She was both the victim and the witness, forced to confront the reality of her failure to protect her daughter. Her heartache was compounded by the public scrutiny of her relationship with Mark. She had been manipulated, blinded by years of emotional abuse and manipulation. But now, with the truth laid bare, she faced the harsh judgment of a town that had once trusted her. Diana became a symbol of both the tragedy and the fragility of domestic relationships. The weight of her own guilt, the knowledge that she had failed Emma, hung heavy on her shoulders. For the prosecution, the case was cut and dry. Mark's history of abuse, the forensic evidence, the testimonies from neighbors and teachers, all of it painted a clear picture of a man who had systematically tortured his daughter. But even with the overwhelming evidence, the road to a conviction was not easy. Mark's defense team worked tirelessly to cast doubt on the details of the case. trying to manipulate the legal system to their advantage. They questioned every piece of evidence, trying to find a loophole, a way to reduce his sentence or get him acquitted entirely. But the jury was not swayed. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll on everyone involved became evident. Emma's tragic death became the focal point of a much larger conversation about child abuse and the systemic failures that allowed it to continue. The town of Willow Creek, still reeling from the shock, found itself forced to confront its own complicity, its own failure to intervene. Neighbors, friends, even teachers had known something was wrong but had failed to act. The trial brought these uncomfortable truths to light, and for many, that was the hardest part to face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty. Mark was convicted of first-degree murder, and the town of Willow Creek exhaled, but there was no real sense of closure. Emma was gone, and nothing could bring her back. The conviction brought justice, but it did little to heal the wounds left by her death. For Diana, the pain of losing her daughter was a wound that would never fully heal, and for the community, the scars of the tragedy would linger long after the trial was over. The road to justice had been long and grueling, but the real work of healing, of reckoning with the past, was just beginning.